Madam Chair, at Berkeley Government, we believe that an unrestricted market is the best way to allocate resources worldwide. We think that countries restricting their own exports overseas in an attempt to undersupply the rest of the world and capture monopoly rents is harming the development of other countries. Because when you undersupply them to try and raise the prices for your own goods, you are depriving poor developing countries of the food and the minerals that they need in order to thrive. Whether this is done for economic or for political reasons, we think that undersupplying the rest of the world is impoverishing the rest of the world, and that's why we must get rid of export restrictions on food and rare earth metals. Three arguments. Firstly, the WTO's role to maximise free trade. Secondly, how this improves international free trade. And thirdly, a look at why political trade sanctions are evil. So firstly, to why the WTO's role is to maximise free trade. And we see that that is the founding obligation of the members that have signed up to that organisation. That is what it exists for, to create as fair and free a market as possible amongst nations. And that their charter means they have to do that by minimising state barriers between the trade between nations. Under the status quo, we see a system where countries agree to that in principle, but don't want to bear the costs of that personally. They want other countries to be taking away their export restrictions, but to maintain some of their own. So why does that happen? They want to receive the benefit of the cheap manufactures and imports that they get from other countries by limiting their own exports in a way that means that they're depriving the other countries of the reciprocal benefits of being in this institution and preventing the most efficient equilibrium outcome in these markets. We think that that is dreadful. To the extent that the WTO has some dispute mechanisms under the status quo to work out whether or not those restrictions are fair, we say that those dispute mechanisms are always worse when you give them bullshit grounds like anti-dumping to justify the restrictions that they make to trade. Yes.
2005, in Karp and shouldn't the country be able to take livelihood above everything?
Alright, well, we think that we don't see how that would have affected that, because that would just, they would be able to buy other foods and bread for us who were particularly you can just, if they are able to export the rice for money and then able to tax that and redistribute that amongst their people in a way that means that they can buy other food. And by the way, like Vietnam is not the only poor people that we're talking about in this debate. Presumably Vietnam would have been exporting that rice to other countries who also have a right to eat it depending on whether or not they're able to pay for it. So we think that you're harming the developing countries trade food amongst themselves as well, and that restriction would harm people in other developing countries. Alright, second argument I want to bring is about how this improves international trade. And firstly, we would say that under the status quo, countries are restricting their own exports to other countries in order to undersupply the rest of the world. Because if they restrict that supply that they give to the rest of the world, then they artificially get a higher price by doing that. And we think that the result of that is that it's unfair, because individual countries are then able to get a higher price for those goods than they otherwise would on an open market. They're able to get monopoly rents from that. We say that that undermines development in other countries, because that makes people in other countries pay more for food, or pay more for the materials for construction and development that they need. The second way that the status quo harms international trade is anti-dumping. Because although this topic is about export restrictions, we think that countries make reciprocal deals with each other that they will prevent their own suppliers from dumping in other countries' markets in exchange for those countries not dumping in theirs. But we say that has particularly pernicious harms in this debate because it makes it harder to get rid of surplus agricultural products when you have a particular bumper crop in a particular bumper year, because those countries have bound themselves to other countries not to export it. What happens as a result then is that countries that have produced too much of one of their goods, in order to maintain that deal with another country, will allow that food to rot rather than export it to other countries because of that long-term deal. We say that's particularly harmful. Because if local producers were still the most efficient at doing that, they would be able to resist a way of being dumped in having that food dumped in that country in one particular year and ride it as a one-off by borrowing against the cost of a future crop. That actually anti-dumping laws are allowing countries to continue producing goods beyond the point that is the most efficient thing to produce. And that this often has the effect of meaning that countries continue to produce cash crops things like coffee that people can't actually eat, rather than making a shift towards things that could be consumed domestically or exported for money to buy more food, such as food crops rather than cash crops, and that's a problem. So at the end of this international trade argument, what we see is that the developing world would still be able to get money for their exports under our model, but they would also not be subject. They would not be subject to the protectionism by stealth that the developed world is able to inflict on them by these reciprocal anti-dumping agreements and by this artificial constriction of supply that allows rich world producers to be able to extract monopoly rents from restricting their own exports to these countries. So we think this way is the best way to feed people and to develop the third world. Last item I want to look at is about political trade sanctions and why those are evil. Because by restricting your own exports to other countries because you don't like their regime, because you don't like their politics, we think has pernicious harms. But it means that the cost of the politics of the rich country is borne by the poor population who are trying to starve in the developing world in order to force political change. That is incredibly unfair because those people did not choose to live in that state. We would further argue that it's particularly counterproductive. Because we think that impoverishing those people further means that they are less likely to be able to fight against their political oppression when they're also economically oppressed and unable to earn more than a subsistence wage or get educated. And it also justifies the anti-Western narratives of those countries that they are being starved by the evil West, and that actually entrenches the power of the most evil governments when you start using things that are as basic as resources and food as a political tool. So at the end of this speech, what I've told you is that the World Trade Organization has to try and strip out all these distortions in the market if people are to be able to develop freely with international trade. And then using the international trade as a way to benefit your own supplies or others is harming people in the third world and it is an ineffective and bad way to achieve political change. We're very proud of it.
Two points today: how the rich game the system today, how they game the international markets, and how they mess with poor countries. And then secondly, ways ruins the lives of those in the developed world, how their agricultural system is destroyed, and why actually the WTO currently makes people starve. Okay, however, number one, a pricing on the kind of things we like and we support, and then secondly, three areas of rebuttal. What do we like? We like quotas, we like tariffs, we like national companies, we like import restrictions, we like export restrictions. Quite frankly, we even dubious about the value of the WTO full stop, right? So their first point is relatively moot. But let's go into it now to see what they do have to say. Number one, we don't really like the WTO. Why? Probably most of my first point. But we think that it's basically because the rich can game the system. We're told that, well, it's not fair that, currently, if you put an import restrictions, you can deprive people of reciprocal benefits and fair trade. We'll tell you why trade isn't fair under the kind of WTO systems that are used to crack open poor countries, buy out their resources, and then use things like common agricultural policy to protect Western nations, right? And we think that, therefore, the notion of reciprocal benefits is an illusion, and therefore not one that we need to protect. Right? Okay. Then we're told that this undermines development in other nations who now can't access these commodities. Number one, we don't envisage this being like, we'll keep everything. That would probably be stupid, right? We can do things like, say, depress prices of commodities in our nation, and therefore encourage national industry in a nation that doesn't have large amounts of high skills employment. Again, more about that in my speech. Secondly, we're told anti-dumping is banned. I mean, the fact that they have to price you with this is, well, it's not really relevant to this debate. It's probably an indication that it's not really relevant. But let's look at what they did say. First of all, they're like, well, we like reciprocal deals. They'll tell you again more of the substantive about why rich nations basically use things like green loans to create reciprocal deals between themselves, which are harder to enforce with developing nations. But we also say, right, the second part of their analysis was this allows food to rot. Again, more on this second point, but let's have a couple of things first. That's not true. Food doesn't necessarily rot. What they like to do is they like destroying, at the whim of when it's convenient, right? So when Congress deems it convenient one year, but not the next, we need to have like a fluctuating level of supply of food, which is not a kind of safe way of maintaining food security in a nation. Right? That kind of thing influences growing cash crops and tenure, because ultimately people who grow real food can't sell it certain years, but iron farmers have just grown too much for the enormous pork barrel subsidies that currently and not sanctioned by the WTO, the US are incredibly rich. Okay, thirdly, we've got political trade sanctions. Three reasons for this, no trade, no sanctions. Number one, people bear the weight of this. Now, I think show you in our case, we think that most people will do this, but it's good for their nation as well. So we think that's a wash, right? Secondly, we're told what political sanctions are bad. Okay, we think it's also sometimes good to defend your geopolitical interests, right? Perhaps other nations are threatening you, and you would like to use that way. We think that using your leverage as trade barriers is sometimes a good thing for the whole nation, so we think that's necessarily bad. Thirdly, we're told this will reinforce anti-Western rhetoric. Okay, at the point at which the WTO is destroying the markets, again, more about this later, at the point at which the IMF, for example, forces you to privatise the entire nation, and yet it remains a Western domination path full of white people who destroy nations year in, year out. We think anti-Western rhetoric is pretty powerful currently, under the model that they support. Right, substantial material. Okay, how do we rich gain the system? But first of all, go on.
Export restrictions, for example, between the US and China or in South America are often caused from stable and political tensions. Do you think that trade provides particular incentives to overcome these tensions?
No, not necessarily. We think geopolitical interests also exist and are often exceptionally powerful. Both exist in this world. We think that it's probably good that you have some tools to respond to that. At the point at which you don't have an enormous army, for example, to develop a nation, but you do have, most of the coal town in the world, if that's your one tool of getting throwing weight about the geopolitical stage, you probably think that's a good thing for you to have some kind of control over. Okay, but let's talk about why the rich gain the system. Let's now think about how the WTO operates. Two things. Number one, legal teams, right? The bottom side of the nation should never have a single lawsuit to the WTO about things like export restrictions, about import restrictions, and tariffs. Why is this bad? Well, it means that they don't really have any power in the WTO. So dealing with a lot of the material that came out in the first place, because it can never challenge the country in the developing world, the developed world, for doing to profit themselves by, for example, subsidising all their farmers, by, for example, dumping all their produce in your nation, thus destroying your industry and keeping you poor, right? It means that ultimately your ascension in the WTO is completely moot. We say that what legal teams also do is they do things like developed nations bring forward enormous lawsuits to crack open these markets, saying these import restrictions exist. We would like your oil, we would like your coltan. Our cultural multinational organisations, by the way, who are not going to pay tax in your nation realistically, and therefore profit you very minimally. Because let's face it, when things are sold totally on an open market, they go to the lowest possible price level for the amount of kind of profit the individual nations make. Is absolutely minimal. We say that these markets in the WTO who don't have to show their own. Rich nations profit disproportionately through these legal teams. We say secondly, there are trade routes. These tend to be held for a very long time, very far away, based on consensus decisions. Three problems again. Number one, they're very far away. It is difficult to afford to send a single representative when you are not a rich nation, right? African countries were disproportionately underrepresented in the Doha rounds, right? We say similarly, in addition, they've hold on for a very long time, so keeping someone there is also difficult. If you look, for example, at the negotiations in Seattle, a lot of negotiations people have in green room situations where you can literally, as it happens with Senegalese delegate, be fitted in documentary. So two rich nations can basically come together, decide what they want to do, and exclude nations that are inconvenient to them. We say that's bad. Secondly, why it ruins the lives of the people in those nations. Malawi in the 1990s was forced to open its agricultural market, sell its grain, fruits, and its food on the open market. 3 years later, there was a famine in which over 10,000 people died, right? Because the point is that the agricultural industry has suffered a massive financial shock because the kind of price supports that are in place meant that agriculture, like small scratch farmers, who we do say cost slightly more, we don't really mind that because at least they're employed, at least there's some degree of food security. No, we're no longer producing food. We say at the point at which the WTO results in deaths, we say that's unacceptable. We say that the analysis about EU flooding and destroying agricultural markets that came out in rebuttal deals a lot with this, and we say that's totally unacceptable to have rich nations game the system and screw the developing world. And very, very
In response to the opening opposition, I'm going to do a number of things. First, I'm going to defend the WTO. Second, I'm going to look at the relationships between rich and poor nations, and which best facilitates the price stability these guys said was so important for poor nations' agricultural industries. Then substantively, I'm going to bring two further arguments. First, I'm going to look at the harms to future multilateral integration and contrast that against their particular argument against abandoning the pursuit of the WTO. And then I'm going to look at price stability and political grandstanding. A couple of things first in response. The open opposition in today's debate were pro-tariffs, they were pro-export restrictions, they were pro-allowing any individual nation at any individual point in time to decide on the basis of their national interest what was best for their national industries. I'm going to take on the hefty burden in this debate and defend free trade. For a couple of reasons. The first is that they claim that in no stage in democratic history have the bottom two-thirds of nations gained significant benefits. I refer you, for instance, to the Uruguay round, where global subsidies for agriculture fell from 40% to 20%. We would argue that with a perfect system, we would note the failures of the Doha round. But in many circumstances, that's enormously benefited developing nations by virtue of their participation in the system. Second point of response to this material relates to the very logic of the opt-out. If it is true that countries can legitimately opt out of instances where they can go to the WTO, the very incentives of rich nations are to pursue exclusive regional areas like the common agricultural policy that disproportionately and permanently harm the ability of those countries to access those markets. We think that's something that happens when you abandon projects of the WTO. Third response means that consumers in those countries are likely to have lower prices on other goods because they benefit from free trade manufacturing and participating in a system that pursues lower tariffs and subsidies in agriculture as well. When you pursue a system which is likely to have exclusive benefits, we think that's particularly problematic. What then was the second argument we heard? The second argument related both from the closing point of information and to the opening in relation to the fact that the rich nations gain far more from these systems. A couple of responses here. The first is there was no response to Paul's analysis that in circumstances where you're allowed to cite temporary instances of justifications for your national interest, why don't you fight a kind of creeping and permanent protectionism that nations never abandon an unlawful project of the World Trade Organization to begin with? That's particularly response to instances like the one of information about the Japanese rice supply. Because if you abandon the pursuit of those particular instances, then you give Japan the political cover to continue to control its access to its rights on the global market in circumstances where the Japanese people would have access to that food at far cheaper prices. When you allow legitimate self-interest, even in wealthy nations, to do that, you mean that that's particularly harmful. See also Argentina and America controlling global wheat supplies at particular points in time, which are grains that can be feeding people in other instances. When you allow rich nations to do that as well, that's an incentive that they have. I'm going to look particularly at Malawi and Vietnamese examples substantially when I talk about maximising price stability. But my first point in today's debate substantively is about how this harms future multilateral integration. In circumstances where you allow nations to individually creep up their own protectionist measures on their own justifications, we think it leads to particularly pernicious outcomes. One particularly pernicious outcome, closing opposition to deal with this in instances like Australia, putting anti-works and trying to pursue things like New Zealand apples, and the supply to those goods that even become permanent members of protectionist policies. We think circumstances like global banana markets, where for instance people decide like temporary hurricanes and these ways to control the supply of tropical fruits, those things become creeping protectionism. But most importantly, politically, the failures of the Doha round are never going to be rectified in circumstances where you allow nations to pursue free trade agreements and in fact encourage nations to pursue free trade agreements outside the World Trade Organization. Because precisely the world these guys say was so horrible is the world is likely to emerge under their proposal. When you get people pursuing NAFTA and the EU rather than global multilateral protection, reductions in protectionism, we think that's particularly problematic in relation to rare metals. In circumstances where those metals are concentrated in particular regions of the world, the rest of the world loses out in circumstances where people pursue regional rather than international multilateral integration. We think that's particularly problematic. I'll take over. Okay, I just do not believe that all nations who have met the requirements to get admission to the World Trade Organization can't ever send delegates first of all. For having WTO's legal aid, if that's something we're going to do in these instances. We think in many circumstances the dispute resolution mechanisms are a mechanism where like small nations like New Zealand can sue big nations like Australia. That's happened in the past. We think that's something that those nations can do. But also, it belies the fact that you're claiming that 2/3 of the world's nations have ever benefited through consensus negotiations like the Uruguay round. They're able to extract enormous concessions because they control global food supplies. They have the resources in their countries, which gives them political power in those consensus negotiations, we think that's something they're willing to use in this debate. Second, I'm going to bring substantively about why this maximises price stability. Kinds of famines and shocks to food supplies like the rice in Vietnam and the grains in Malawi come in circumstances where you allow individual nations to impose global shocks on the price of a particular commodity. That's something they can easily do when they're allowed or legitimately able to use export restrictions at a particular point in time to control those supplies. Because that's never the case. Maybe people make smaller profits on their farms in the meantime, and maybe that's not suboptimal for them. But in terms of global allocation of resources, we think it minimises the kinds of shocks that lead to situations in Malawi. Malawi example is never analysed to an extent to prove what WTO participation had done to harm those particular actions. It was never analysed in comparative to what the Malawians had benefited from in terms of their imports by participating in that system. We thought that was particularly important in Spain. In circumstances where we've seen the damaging effects of like oil shocks, and we know oil on particular but the kinds of crises that you can commit, like controlling the supply of particularly good on the global market and imposing inflation on other nations, is particularly damaging in circumstances where you do that. Maybe that doesn't happen with bananas, but it can equally happen with things like wheat, which are basic goods that affect the supply of all other industries, and this is essential in those countries. It also happens in the reverse, with deflationary shocks. So global farmers of coffee were particularly harmed when they drop thousands of tons of coffee beans that they particularly not on the market in previous years because of export restrictions, and the price of coffee collapsed in circumstances where people were unable to continue to plant their crop the next year. That particularly affects those farmers on the margin who need that particular annual revenue to afford the coffee beans to plant for the next year. Finally, briefly about political ground standing. The kind of protectionism you get under the model proposed by the opposition leads to the kind of disputes like China and the US had over rubber supplies. In circumstances where you allow a legitimate nation and you give them the excuse, as Yoho would do to say, it's legitimate to protect our self-interest. If the US could pursue protectionism in the aftermath of the global financial crisis to the detriment of all developing nations, they put restrictions on rubber supplies into the United States to protect their own tire industry, and that leads to political tension between those two nations, which have far worse implications down the line. We're very proud.
I think it's important to note this debate doesn't take place in a world where the World Trade Organization works by all of the mantras that it set out in its founding documents and all the principles that we might like to ignore. It takes place in a world of sidestepping, of bullying, and of rich countries dominating the Natasha lifestyle. The only response we get to this is, I just find that somewhat implausible. Unfortunately, the world can sometimes be a fairly implausible place, where rich countries act in their own interests, and where we're not having the sort of level playing field that these guys presuppose in order to have the fair and free markets that they like. In closing these talks today, I'm going to do two things. First, I'm going to respond to what we heard about opening. Then I'm going to bring you our third counterpoint, which is going to be a principal positive case for the right to protections. So first of all, I've got 6 points to put. First point we get coming out of the first speaker is this idea that it's really important to have free and fair trade. That free and fair trade can only work at the point at which there is a level playing field. At the point at which there is not, we say it's legitimate for smaller countries who primarily sit at one against taking advantage of this, because recognise that the rich countries who they say already engage in stellar protectionism are going to continue to do so whether or not this policy happens. So we're giving small countries a tool to correct the imbalances and create the sort of level playing field that these guys want. They say in fact that it's simply implausible that this is happening. This is what happens under the status quo. You've got small countries who are simply too underfunded to be able to send delegates, who don't have the sort of legal knowledge and legal experience that nations such as the US and China can do in order to drag out that dispute to their side, and they can simply bully countries into dropping any dispute straight away. Their world is a rich man's world, and we're not having to stand alongside it. It's not going to change. They're not going to see the sort of measure that they want, because it's simply not a rich country's interest. No, thank you. Second point we get is this sort of idea of anti-dumping. Again, evidence to add on to the status quo, there's the rich boys club. As I'm going to move on to tell you my substantive, what we're actually going to encourage them to move away from the sorts of cash crops that these guys find so heinous by creating the incentive to create national industries, creating capacity to do. Next sort of element, third principle, is this idea of geopolitics. So we get this idea from last week, but thank you, that nations are entitled to grandstanding when you've got these, when you're allowed to place export and import restrictions. First of all, recognise that this occurs under the world and it occurs exclusively between the big countries. What we're saying is it is useful and it's legitimate for smaller countries to use their trade as a geopolitical bargaining tool and give them something to respond to bullying rich nations. Thank you. We also say, ladies and gentlemen, that they talk about saber rattling. We'd rather the saber was one made from bags of maize rather than nuclear weapons. So we think it's legitimate for countries to use their national exports and imports as a tool in bargaining. No, thank you. Next sort of idea we get, and fourth idea in the rebuttal, is this idea that developing nations participating in the states. So they give us the example of the sort of food aid that was given. As Tash points out in her speech, and we get no response to it, this is an unsustainable way for countries to first of all exercise their hegemony over smaller countries and use it as a geopolitical tool, and secondly, never allow countries the need for self-sufficiency. They call it protectionism, we call long-term self-sufficiency. No, thank you. The next thing here that says that we're going to get countries siphoning off into smaller regional markets. First of all, recognise this happens under the status quo. Moreover, we say we'd be quite happy if developing countries also were to form like smaller trading blocks. We'd be quite happy to see something like ASEAN become more and more of a trading block. I think that'd be good in terms of fostering regional unity and regional stability. No, thank you. Fifth point to rebuttal, the idea that it's going to harm global multilateralism. First of all, recognise they've never proved why global multilateral, that's a hard word, is a good idea. We say it's not in a lot of instances, as Tasha pointed out. When you've got global multilateralism, you give richer countries and the countries who are in the agreement with the WTO in the Seattle round complete authority over the direction of those negotiations. Final point to rebuttal, and after which I'll take closing, the idea of price stability. They say that crises of food, the idea here is crises of food don't develop from price shocks. Price shocks are often a response to drought. Malawi didn't suffer a massive famine because there was sudden price shocks. They suffered because of a horrendous lack of rain. We say that at the point at which there are major price shocks in the global market, that's probably something terrible that's happening in your country, so which you should be able to mitigate it by ensuring the long-term protection. We also say that when price shocks are happening more, we incentivise other countries to work together to find solutions to the problems that caused them in the first place. Forming one substantive closing.
The one issue is the wrong percent of loopholes to energy protection myself. Why don't we remove those loopholes, force them to engage with them so that the US can't, for example,
there are loopholes, right? The regulations of the WTO are often incredibly stringent. It's just they've got incredibly good lawyers. Moreover, even if the lawsuit is going to be one which small countries could plausibly be expected to win in the long term, they are disincentivized from engaging in that dispute because of the length and because of the arduous nature of these lawsuits in the long term. We've also, moreover, in terms of removing loopholes, we're giving a positive case as to why having extra restrictions would be a good idea. So even in a pragmatic sense, that idea is away. On a more principled sense and in a longer term sense, our idea is a good track. Moving into substantive, the right to protect our nations. These guys say protectionism is going to be encouraged, long-term protectionism in developing countries. We say that to be an incredible good thing. We say first and foremost, ladies and gentlemen, the nations have the right and the obligation to protect their own citizens. Because that's what they derive from the WUDC from. That's how they get into power. We say the primary obligation is to protect your citizens above and beyond those of others. We say this means that this obligation is especially acute in the instance of countries in the developing world. In fact, for a few reasons, because the sorts of things that give people a good quality of life, for example, their security, their food, their prosperity, and long-term stability in the country, are in a lot more precarious situation in developing countries than the majority of the developed world. In fact, these inequalities are exacerbated by the instance of the sorts of sanctions that these guys are saying. What we're giving to you is an effective way of allowing countries to immerse their own people from poverty. Why is this the case? First of all, because you erect the sorts of barriers to mitigate against short-term crises in the way that Tasha said in the example of Malawi in the 1990s, which had no response. Or moreover, at the point at which you can depress prices in your country by increasing high levels of produce, having high levels of commodity, you're more likely to get the incentive of people to develop companies. To the point at which you can't simply flow all of your resources to other countries if you're a rich man or someone who owns a large level or has access to a large level of natural resources. You're incentivized to create national companies within that country. Why is this a good thing? couple of reasons. First off, is it's sustainable in the long term, okay? You're maintaining commodity production. You're not just simply farming them out of the benefit of rich countries. Moreover, you're not creating lots of high-skilled jobs, some tackles out, I guess, literally no response to. Ladies and gentlemen, if you think protectionism to make sure that you are fostering long-term industries and maintaining long-term food stability, we're incredibly fast standards of production. Ladies and gentlemen, the current world and the current World Trade Organization is a rich man's world. It's not one that we're willing to stand for. We oppose.
Ladies and gentlemen, what you have here is a government which identified as the problem the fact that rich countries use their inordinate bargaining power to gain advantage over poor countries due to flaws in the rules of government behaviour. Their solution is to throw open the doors to any and all behaviour, any and all exercise of impartial bargaining power and throw us back to the era of trade negotiation in the day of the Eastern Empire Trading Company. What we're going to give you in extension is an example and a demonstration of what life actually looks like without free trade restrictions, looking at what the race to the bottom means in terms of tariffs, and saying what the security implications are on a global level, and how we can avoid this by strengthening rather than reducing WTO control and regulation. Before I do so, a couple of points involved. Firstly, the idea of protectionist right. Secondly, the idea that compressing internal prices is a good idea. And finally, the idea that poor countries cannot, for life, live for the lawyer. Firstly, the idea of a protectionist right. We think we have two responses here. Firstly, the right that you're actually talking about here is the right to starve a neighbour's population for your own economic gain. We don't think that is a particularly good characterisation, particularly when what we're advocating here is food protection. Secondly, it is stupid to do so. So whether or not the right exists, in the long run, removing that right works to the benefit of all individuals throughout the world. And for that reason, we're happy to advocate. Secondly, the idea that depressing internal prices is good. No. The scenario we're getting here is that in a poor country, they need to control the export of their food resources in order to feed their own people. Firstly, note who is paying the price for the reduction price in this particular situation. It is the poor farmers that produce that food resources themselves that lose the windfall that comes from exporting them at higher prices. Secondly, you are also denying poor individuals across the border access to that food, and at the same time, the poor country access to the financial windfall that comes from those higher prices. Depressing your internal prices is not a good idea. But secondly, let's recognise that in the majority of cases, export restrictions aren't about depressing internal prices. They're about raising external prices. This is about China increasing the price of consumer electronics. This is about America protecting its domestic market in tyres, even though China can do it better, cheaper, and more efficient. We don't think we want to stand for that sort of thing in this debate. Finally, the idea that all countries cannot afford lawyers. And I think this will lead you well into my closing material. A, to whatever extent a poor country cannot afford a lawyer, it cannot afford all the tools it needs to fight a bilateral trade negotiation with a far stronger actor like the United States or China. Secondly, it doesn't matter how good your lawyer is. If instead of this massive pool of loopholes, there is a simple rule that says no export restrictions. I don't care why, I don't care how, no export restrictions in function, form, or style. It doesn't matter how good your lawyer is, you cannot get around those sort of restrictions. And as long as you can actually get it to the table, you'll get those restrictions bypassed. Positive material. What does life look like without the WTO? I'm going to split this into a couple of points. One, why protectionism is a race to the bottom. Secondly, why it replaces universal rules with bilateral rules. And finally, power, influence, and instability and security. So on this first point, what does protectionism actually look like? Let's give you some basic game theory analysis here. We accept that the basic free market, wherever it trades for the individuals who are willing to pay most for it, is probably the most efficient global distribution of resources. But for any individual country, there is a motivation to skew that in your favour. Protectionism enables you to gain an advantage by replacing the actual market motivations with an artificial imposition by your government. As soon as your neighbour does that, you must respond with the same sort of measures in order to compensate to remain competitive on the international field. If America introduces a protectionist measure, China must do so or it will lose market share. Necessarily, that's a process which is never going to escalate until you have massive impositions of protectionist measures, which is what powered the introduction of the WTO in the first place. Because at that point, you have an absolute madness where the collective advantage different countries have in producing different goods is wasted as those goods simply do not transfer across borders effectively. Given that, what do you see in terms of replacing the rules that govern that trade? We think universal rules are far fairer, no thank you, than the bilateral rules which will necessarily replace them. WTO rulings affect all member states. When the reductions in agricultural subsidies came in, they affected Burkina Faso, but they also affected France and the common agricultural policy. When you have bilateral negotiations between individual countries in the absence of the WTO, you have individual rules that don't have to be balanced between those particular countries. So consider for a moment a powerful country like the United States negotiating with a far less powerful actor. It is likely that the more desperate actor is going to concede to far greater concessions to the more powerful actor than it would if a universal rule set was applied on both parties. I'm going to explain to you why that power influence is particularly harmful, but first, okay.
And other forms of industry. And the developing nations only have the capacity to do things like export restrictions. They're simply not afford things like subsidies. Why is it better than the quality markets you think?
Okay, so your solution to this particular problem is A, to throw open the doors with all sorts of protections measures, and secondly, this one has to be necessary for any protections measures. We think this is one particularly pernicious style of protections measure. It happens to be the debate today. But we're happy to go against subsidies, we're happy to go against all sorts of trade restrictions because we stand for free market trade. Whether it's a particularly difficult concept to grasp in this debate. Let's talk about power rebalance between these countries and what this actually means in terms of this key security implications. We think that some of the most pernicious and damaging trade wars right now are going on between superpowers. They're going on between China and the United States over things like rubber exports, rare earth metal exports. They're going on in the developing South American region over control over mining exports into products like copper in the Chilean context. What we think these do is they provide a massive source of diplomatic and political tension between these various states in the region as they engage repeatedly in patriotic and nationalistic retaliatory protectionist measures. This allows them at the political field to paint other countries as their enemies, and as a whole, is destabilising the relationship we need to see into the future between these states. What happens when you have a WTO rule out these kind of measures is you have each side unilaterally essentially disarmed at the same time and come to the table absent the sort of tensions that we're seeing as a result of these measures. The optimum outcome for all of these countries is that we all trade freely. But we will logically never arrive at that point unless it is imposed at the same time on all actors by an exterior body. The only body we have available to us in this debate is the World Trade Organization. So because we fear the harms that might come if Obama places retaliatory tariffs on Chinese products, which riles up Chinese nationalism, leads to retaliatory tariffs against exports to the United States. Because we fear the power imbalance and the reality of trade between a powerful actor and a non-powerful actor in the environment where there is no international regulation to track the behavior between those states. We are happy to stand for advancement of the optimum outcome, which is the free trade outcome in this debate. Thank you very much.
Madam Speaker, because the opposition, we're going to explain to you the actual economic effects on the economies of both developing and developed countries when you allow the market to be literally flooded with rare minerals and food. Don't think that's been done in the debate so far. But first, I'm going to deal with what we heard from both of the opening panels in terms of harm to the WTO and tension between countries. So these guys just assumed that unless every country agrees to lift export restrictions, there will be permanent harm done to trade integration. But that's not the way trade works. Countries will reach agreements in the WTO where they believe that those agreements are mutually beneficial to themselves. So it's not like parts of Latin America are going to go, I'm going to refuse to trade with you, Brazil, because you get export restrictions. If it is true that the trade agreement that they are reaching with Brazil is a mutually beneficial agreement. That's why you still see trade agreements between countries, like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, when there are some protectionist aspects, like New Zealand and Australia being able to retain their ability to bulk buy drugs, because other parts of that agreement are mutually beneficial. Secondly, we say it's still the case on our side that the same rule applies to everyone. It's still the case that everyone is allowed to apply export restrictions. So we don't think there's a sense of unfairness. We think a sense of unfairness comes when countries that aren't as lucky in terms of the amount of food or the amount of minerals that they have are told that your one resource, your one competitive advantage is something that you have to open up to the rest of the world. That's not the case in Vietnam. Vietnam gets to go, well, the USA, you have this great resource of all these wealthy, educated people. We think we should get us a bit of that without having to pay much for it. That's the kind of inequality we think that you see. The last thing we say is that negotiations within the WTO are unequal. Our opening draft did excellent analysis on being unable to understand the rules or unable to have good legal representation. But we say more broadly, it's the wealthiest countries that are the importers. That is why the exporting developing countries have very little ability to bargain, because at the end of the day, Madam Speaker, they have to get America and they have to get the European Union to buy the things that they are exporting. Secondly, we say the WTO is part of the larger bargaining system. If you bring down trade barriers, often the IMF and the World Bank has made that a condition of giving aid and giving loans to a country. We say it is not an equal bargaining system. Last thing we say, the extended anti-West sentiment is created. We say that you have to share all of these abundant resources that you have with us and to press the price of that globally. It discourages people from joining. If you guys are all about how the WTO is really great, you also need to convince East Timor and Afghanistan and Algeria and Ethiopia and Iran and Iraq, all of whom are not current members of the WTO, to join. You do that by letting them join on their own terms and not imposing restrictions. Second issue, or first part of my extension, is about the macroeconomic effects that you see with food. So we say that very simply, when you're in a non-food producing country and you're buying food, you're buying agricultural products, say you're in America or the European Union, you will always be wealthier and able to afford those products from poorer countries. That means that unless there are export restrictions placed and artificial scarcity, people in the food producing country will not be able to afford that food and they will starve. And they will never able to give an adequate response to Ben's information about rice production. These guys like it's best to have the most efficient allocation of goods. The most efficient allocation of goods on their terms is the people who can afford to buy the goods, Mr. Speaker, get to get them. That's not an equal allocation of goods. That's not an allocation of goods that allows everybody in the world to eat. That's an allocation of goods which allows America and the European Union and Australia and New Zealand to use all of their cash to buy all of the resources and then other people die. Secondly, we say in terms of richer countries using export restrictions against each other, there's a limit to which you can do that, right? Because if you artificially increase the price of your exports, there's another country that probably exports the same thing as you, right? So for example, this is a third world example, in Colombia, had huge export restrictions on coffee. El Salvador was able to save a whole bunch of investors. Colombia has artificially increased the price of coffee. That means if you guys invest in coffee plantations, for a while, we'll be able to collect monopoly rents because everyone will buy from us because our goods are cheaper until Colombia decreases its export restrictions. We say that export restrictions will probably naturally decrease over time to some extent anyway, and that you can't have a massive export restriction that stops any food going into the economy. There's always another country that produces the same thing as you. Both Thailand and Vietnam produce rice, Australia, Barbados, and Jamaica produce sugar. Half the countries in the world produce agricultural products. The last thing we say is that countries can turn to subsidies instead. These guys know that we're really against subsidies, but it's impossible to tell India they can't hand out food for their people. It's impossible to tell the Indian government that the Indian government can't buy up a whole lot of food and give it to its people as welfare. That is a subsidy. Why are subsidies worse than export restrictions? It encourages every poor person in India to turn to agriculture, and eventually when those subsidies disappear, Madam Speaker, because the government can no longer afford it, we have a whole lot of incredibly poor people who are stuck in a situation where they have to keep producing more and more of something that is becoming increasingly cheaper, but because they're making less and less money, they have to produce more and more of it. Lastly, on rare earth metals, we say that all that countries in Africa have are metals. All Congo has is $23 trillion in coltan, gold, and diamonds. I'm taking PMI now. Yeah.
Allowing anyone in the international market to buy food creates the incentive for capital to produce more food. Your model makes people keep all their own food and starve them.
Well, not everybody in Thailand is put up to that economy. So nobody in Thailand will be able to afford food because all of the Thai rice paddy farmers will sell all of their food overseas, which means they're big price overseas. When you tell the Thailand rice paddy farmers you have to sell some of your rice in Thailand, that allows the people in Thailand to live. Okay, on to rare meals. We say it's not okay for the Congo to we say that when we tell every producer in the Congo, every person who has a mining company in Venezuela that you can sell as much as you like, a couple of things happen. Firstly, you eventually run out of that mineral, so in 100 years' time, that economy has got nothing to sustain itself. Secondly, we say that you encourage farming of agriculture, but also minerals in a really unsustainable way, because there's no guarantee that the mining company next to you isn't also exploiting everything and selling everything as fast as possible, because the government has told them it's okay for them to do that. So they have no incentive to preserve the resource, they have a bigger incentive to make a quick profit over time. That drives down the price for everyone, but also means the developed world buys coltan too fast and runs out of coltan that you guys are living to have, and that is why we oppose.
Ladies and gentlemen, at the end of today's debate, despite all the examples we've heard about poor staff people in Vietnam, the one elephant in the room that exists is what happens if you're a poor nation that can't export food. And that's really the crux of this debate, right? Because that is the particular thing that free trade provides. It gives you the capacity to use whatever resource you particularly have to help other people. The second particular tier to that argument is that these export restrictions are frequently not to benefit the consumers in these countries. They are frequently to make it far more difficult to promote industry to make prices far higher for those consumers in that country. Those are our two principal reasons why we think free trade and the WTO in general are fantastic. But I'm going to get more obvious. So, two questions at the end of today's debate. First, is the WTO and free trade economically good or bad? And then secondly, which model best produces better political outcomes? So on the first one, whether the WTO and free trade is economically good or bad. What we provided you at extension was a very basic but surprisingly unheard of explanation for why these types of bodies are really necessary, because they lower those individual incentives to not cooperate and the individual base of the bottom which necessarily exists. The only opposition that started today's debate were pro-tariff and pro-export restrictions. What we think the problem with that is that the incentives for individual countries is always to protect your own interests unless there is a framework for doing otherwise. The reason that we think the WTO is necessarily good at providing this framework is it is the most representative of all those frameworks which exist. And we think people will necessarily gravitate towards those types of frameworks. So that's the first question. They conceded then that loopholes existed under the common policy. And we asked the POI, we said that this removes certain loopholes which currently exist. The answer that we got from OO was incredibly clear. They told us, well, we think that there are better lawyers. Regardless of whether or not they have better lawyers, it is easier to be a better lawyer when there is a vast wealth of loopholes that lawyer can exploit than when you are simply saying, are you limiting the trade between these two countries? That's our first response. Our second response is the one I flagged at my intro. We think that what these policies often do is they function to harm consumers, they function to raise prices for those individuals. We think that that's completely problematic. The third answer is what if you are a poor, non-food producing country, right? Because we can hear all the tear we want about Vietnam, and we care about those people too, ladies and gentlemen. But to the same extent, there are drought-ridden countries in Africa which are fundamentally unable to produce those types of food. We think that there are immense problems on that front. So, the second important point on this rebuttal for why the WTO and free trade are principally fantastic is the counterfactual that both sides in today's debate recognise existed to some extent. So we recognise that there will still be an incentive to form alliances, but the debate at this point in time hinges on which one of those alliances is best able to provide outcomes. So whether it's individual alliances like the Common Agricultural Policy, like the North American Free Trade Alliance, or whether it is broader, more sweeping policies that engage more members of society. We've got 3 reasons why their proposal is more problematic. Firstly, other groups are shut out. We got a little bit of a response to this from Stephanie Extension. She said, well, how are you going to get countries like Iran, a couple of others that have basically got non-class great war and set up members of the WTO? We think that the way you get them is you increase the incentive for them to enter those institutions. We think there are serious problems with those institutions right now because the loopholes exist, which fundamentally benefit Western states. We told you in Extension that the states which have been increasing tariffs most since the global financial crisis are countries like America, who in response to China wanting to import more tires decided to tariff those products. Those are where the restrictions exist. You get the political will and buy-in to respond to their extension through having this type of policy so that it's not seen as so overarching.
Right now, in order to free trade, and therefore why doesn't it exist?
We think the WTO stands for free trade, but we recognise that there is a realpolitik element to the WTO as a function. This debate presumes that we are voting, as WTO member states do, to change these types of things. We're talking about rights and good policy. Right. So, on to the other 2 reasons why we think that their counterfactual is more problematic. Secondly, we think that it limits the number of people who are actually within those bodies. We think that that means that it's really problematic because the other countries simply aren't able to engage in that process. The third problem that we particularly brought as extension is that political alliances form in the types of bodies that those guys want to talk about. So you'll get political alliances which only exist between particular countries. We think that the way you actually increase political goodwill and you decrease political tension between countries is you get them trading together. So we think the best way to do that is to be able to limit these types of restrictions that currently exist. We thought that that was a fundamental. What we told you, in particular, was that there were disputes like that between China and the US. Under the status quo, there is no way to resolve those types of disputes, which are fundamentally a race to the bottom between those nations, right? We think there are cultural things that exist, for example, that might even transcend their economics. So the fact that, for example, in China, there are cultural elements that say you shouldn't back down on those particular things because of the concept of saving face. For example, there were sanctions on Guatemala, which actually inhibited Guatemala because they didn't want to rail against it about 20 years ago despite being in their best interest because they viewed the US as an overarching aggressor, ladies and gentlemen. You've shut down those political tensions. You've increased that political goodwill under our model. It's fundamentally. So which model does better produce political outcomes then? We told you at Extension that we're in a particular context politically, right? You see members like Russia and China that are relatively new members to the WTO. We think that what our policy does is it decreases the political tensions because it gives you less ability and less capacity to stand up and punish other nations for no particular reason. We think, secondly, the best way to get buy-in from these particular countries is to have policies which are seen as less imperialistic and which are seen as less problematic for those individual smaller states. The second thing that those guys opposing opposition told us in their extension was that this operates in a larger context, right? It's often contingent on high influence. Precisely, ladies and gentlemen, those are the loopholes which exist under the status quo, which inhibit the capacity of states to meaningfully operate on a level playing field. That was precisely not a good point for them, but in the status quo that we're seeking to escape from on government in today's day. Ladies and gentlemen, at the end of government bench, what we recognise today is that fundamentally these institutions exist to remedy a natural race to the bottom which exists in world markets. We're very happy to oppose that race to the bottom and to provide a framework so that the whole world can get along, not just economically, but politically as well. We were very happy to propose.
Countries who want to join WTO. So they have been forced to give up a mechanism that allows them to support their own people. For a lot of developing countries, it's a mechanism by which they're actually provided power in the first place. But they already know that they're going to go into an environment inside of which the rules are essentially stacked against them. That they want to get access to other people's markets they don't currently have access to. They're the ones who are exporting and the others in the countries who are importing. And there are lots of non-members themselves have minerals and food producers. And they've seen how the US has treated countries in the Middle East. They've seen how hard a bargain has been struck with those countries that do produce oil. And they drive such a hard bargain. These countries are going to be especially resentful. They try, and these countries want to say to them, you have to be able to export all of your materials whilst no ability to restrict it.
either for the preservation of their own people or for the long-term development of that economy. We don't think that suddenly getting rid of all the coltan inside of places like Rwanda is great for Rwanda. We think that stretching it out for a long period of time is much better under the procure and national revolution, a little bit later on. We'd say that the trade deals are usually beneficial and different. But when you make people a lot more unlikely to not want to join the WTO, not want to do deals, when they feel like one of the bargaining chips that they have is immediately off the table as soon as they join that environment, that they lose any ability to have this to give them a better deal. Instead, the deal is solely done in terms of those countries want and all goods. We told you, by fundamentally the WTO isn't necessarily a fair space. The first week of that, as we told you, was that essentially the WTO is run and dominated by countries who need imports, who bring all the products from other countries in the world. Before I continue, I'll take over.
Allowing comparative data as well as dictate supply and resource decreases prices over the long term. Doesn't it go worse than the situation for Taiwan?
I'll talk about why we think this is actually really good for being able to smooth out prices and ensure that people can eat. We think that's the fundamental point and ability for developing economy in my later extension. We think that the second reason that the WTO is particularly unfair is we think that the WTO exists in a sphere of much larger types of negotiations. We say that when America and China go to the WTO negotiating, they do so in the context of a whole other bunch of other negotiations that go on at the same time about aid, about international defence, about international relations. But small countries don't have any of those chips to play. So the only chip they have to play is, please sir, let us get into your country so we can export some of our products to you. At the point at which the Americans say, well, maybe we will, maybe we won't, but they're the ones who dominate the entire conversation. They want very little out of this from these developing countries. It's not like America is desperate to get GM cars into Somalia, ladies and gentlemen. No, thank you. So we don't think WTO is equal in this massively disincentivizes joining those countries. Second question there is, what happens, suppose we have to close the countries that can't export food? We think that even when you lift export restrictions, that these supposedly impoverished countries are still unable to buy those products that come from those other countries, right? Because we think that the analysis we do from closing is completely predicated on the idea that you remove export restrictions, the price completely plummets. But it won't necessarily be true. And why is that? Because most of the types of things that we're exporting, most of these cash crops and commodities, the price is dominated by massively richer countries, ladies and gentlemen. It's dominated by countries that are massively more able to afford the sugar and bananas and wheat and sorghum and rice that these countries provide, as opposed to the next door neighbours that you guys want to make this conversation more about. Yes, quote.
In Australia, Australia, our data and the react, in the absence of externals, which party will be regulated?
We don't think you're going to get some of these parties to join up in the first place to try and make equal rules. We don't necessarily agree that the rules are equal right now, and that point is completely predicated on showing that the rules in the WTO are completely equal for everybody. Isn't it funny? Almost all of the prosecutions in the WTO are taken by massive countries against very tiny countries, and never the other way around. It's because the rules massively favour the US going after dumping like Korea and shrimp, and never the Koreans going after the Americans for their massive agricultural subsidies that exist inside the Iowa ports. We think that when you do lower the price by reducing export extraction, you actually provide no incentive for other countries to actually invest in their own internal agricultural policy, right? So if the price doesn't that massively decrease, as I want to say, it is able for this other country over there, your neighbour, can suddenly buy all of my products. It means that there's no incentive for my neighbour to ever invest in improving their own food security and own food supply. Why? Because their neighbour will always beat them out on price. So there's no incentive to invest or create their own industry. A great example of this, as Steve told you, is the Congo, which is abundantly rich in material. It has almost very little sophisticated agriculture and mostly exists on subsistence farming. Why? Because everybody else's prices around them are essentially too low to bother them to invest or incentivize international investment in these types of things. We think that keeping the prices higher is fine. The last thing we told you is about how this essentially ensures that poor people can be looked after by their own country. Because we just say on the side of the house, it is not the case, despite what they're going to tell you. The government will simply turn around and say, you're all starving, you're all dying, but my hands are literally tied by America, who doesn't want me to subsidise anything, doesn't want me to make sure you can keep rice at the end of the day. So what we would say is that in that situation, we would much prefer export restrictions, which are transparent and are much less distortionary than subsidies that happen instead. What are the kinds of subsidies that we see instead with no response. The first type of subsidy we see is a producer subsidy that massively incentivizes overproduction of a particular type of thing like rice, that binds those people into forever producing that thing at an absolute race to the bottom. The second type of subsidy is a consumer subsidy, and that leads to huge exploitation. It incentivizes me to use my voucher, buy a rice, and send it overseas with more money available to me, again depriving the poor of any available things. The last one we talked about rare earth minerals. We think that it massively incentivizes people to extract the maximum amount of material inside the economy right now, and provides no ability for a country to restrict and say how the long-term development of that resource should be used. So that leaves countries stripped and bare of their only natural competitive advantages, and we think it's fundamentally unfair. We're very proud to stand up for poor countries to support their own people.